Hi everyone, it's Alexander Hagberg here for Team XRAY, and in today's video we're going to talk about the 5 most common errors that X4 users make when they run and set up the car. And these are pretty simple things which are easy to overlook, especially if you're less experienced, if you haven't been racing touring cars a lot. These are very common errors that have very simple fixes which you can quickly change these things accordingly to give your car a better performance and a better handling. And that way you can get more out of your racing and enjoy your hobby even better. So let's start with the list of 5 things which I feel are the most important. I'm quite often approached by racers of different levels, which they have certain problems with the car, with the handling of the car, etc. And these are the most common things that I see are wrong in people's cars. So let's start with the first one. The first one involves the front body shell height and the body upstops, which the body upstops is a built-in feature in the X4. And sometimes it can be difficult to set up properly, and in this next step I'm going to show you how to make sure your front body height is correct and the front body upstops are set correctly. So let's start with the front body height. As you can see, I've got a ride height gauge here to check the distance between the front lip and the floor. So if we talk about European style carpet and asphalt, you want this distance to be around 7 to 8 millimeters. You don't want the body to be any higher than that for that kind of surface. For CRC black carpet, you'll want this to be probably around 9 or 10 millimeters, because the body has a tendency to drag more on that type of surface. But for asphalt and European style of carpet, you need to aim for 8 millimeters here. So as you can see here, there's a bit of a gap here. It's actually closer to 10 millimeters than 8 millimeters. So the body is too high. The negative effect of having the body too high is that you lose front downforce and you lose front grip. The car is going to understeer more. So we're going to drop this body shell down here. I'm just going to remove these 2 O-rings here, which I have sitting on the body post. You can also fine-tune this height with optional body post holders, which they come in 3 steps: 0, 1 and 2 millimeters. So the body is now dropped down and it's now closer to 8 millimeters here. Actually slightly above 8 here on the side and slightly below 8 here in the front. This is the perfect starting point. You might want to fine-tune this depending on the characteristics of the track. If the track is bumpy or have a lot of banked corners, you might want to go a little bit higher depending on how much the body drags. You can hear this from driving along on the track and listen to where the body is dragging. Okay, so the body upstops. The body upstops is these 2 screws here, which are mounted onto the upper arms. You need to set the height of these so that they prevent the body from reaching the floor, but only at the very end of the suspension movement. So let's move the suspension now and see what happens. These body upstops are set incorrectly. Why? Because I push the suspension down and the body isn't moving. It means the screws are way too long and they don't allow the body shell to lower itself together with the suspension. The body is not moving at all. When you have it set incorrectly like this, the body shell is gonna stay level and you're gonna lose a lot of front grip, a lot of steering, especially in slower corners. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take these screws down here, just lower them. And I only want these to touch the body at the very end of the suspension movement. What I'm looking for here is when I push this from the side, see, it's only starting to work at the very end of the movement. So this prevents the body from dragging, but doesn't really take away any steering, because the body is with the suspension all the way till the very end. If I push these down at the same time, you can barely see anything happening, but if I push one post down from the side, you can see that it's actually touching the body shell at the very end. So that's correctly set up front body height and body upstops. The next thing which I often see people overlook or do wrong is the steering EPA, or the steering lock, which you set up with the setup station. As per kit standard, the steering lock is limited by a 7.5mm washer here on the steering assembly, which when you turn the steering to full lock, it limits the steering from going further, which depending on your toe out setting, it should be at about 26 degrees at full lock. But people often set their EPA settings on the radio incorrectly, and the steering ends up binding up at full lock, which when the steering is binding up, it affects the flex negatively of the chassis, and you're gonna have a very negative impact on the handling. So you're gonna lose steering, the cars are gonna be less consistent to drive, and you definitely have a loss in performance. So in this next step, I'll show you how to set up the steering correctly on the setup station using your radio. Okay, so how do we know that we have excessive EPA or too much steering dialed in to the radio? Let's start the car and I will show you. So I disconnected the fans here so they don't disturb what I'm trying to say. The toe out's already set. It's about 1.2 degrees per side. I'm just gonna turn the steering to full lock. You can hear there's an noise from the servo. It means the servo is strained, struggling to keep up with the demand. It means that this point here is pushing onto the steering arm. We have too much EPA in the radio. Same to this side actually even worse. So I'm gonna start and dial this down, and we're gonna see if it makes a difference. We're gonna start with 5 steps on the EPA. How do you get to the EPA? On the Sanwa M17, you open the settings menu, choose steering channel, go down to base. In base, you can set the steering individually left and right. This is referred to as the EPA. So we're gonna turn this down by 5% to begin with. See if that helps. Okay. It's a lot better, but still too much to the one side. To this side is fine, no noise from the servo, and I'm looking for the free movement of the steering link here. So when I can move this link freely with my fingers, it's not bound up, it's not binding, it means there's no excessive strain onto the steering at full lock. To this side, to the right side, however, we still have too much steering. I'm gonna dial this down a little bit until it's quiet. So now you can see the steering arm is moving freely to both sides. And then we double check the steering throw here. It's actually 27 degrees to this side. It's a bit too much to the left. So we're gonna turn down the steering to the left by a couple of steps here. So that is 27 to both sides. And if you want more information about setting up the steering, I recommend you taking a look at my steering setup video for the XRAY X4. There's also a video for the T4 car, which they're both pretty useful about this part of the setup. The third most common error is having the battery mounted too tightly in the car. So on the X4, we have a very nice battery mounting system which doesn't utilize any battery tape, and you simply install the battery in the car using these plastic holders here, which you just turn with your fingers. The battery comes in and out of the car like this, very simple. But a lot of users set these battery mounts too tightly so that the battery cannot move freely. And when these are pushing onto the battery, you you lock the battery into the car, and that's gonna remove a lot of flex and make the car inconsistent to drive, and you're gonna lose overall traction as well. You're gonna lose mechanical grip from the car. So in this next step, I'll show you how to properly set up the play and the mounting for the battery in the car. So incorrectly set up battery holder is gonna make the battery bind up in the car. And the battery holder is designed in a way where the battery is supposed to move freely in each direction. So it should have play up and down a little bit. It should have sideways play like this. Not excessive play in any direction, but just enough for the battery to move freely, so that when the chassis is flexing, the battery is not obstructing the flex of the chassis. That's the idea, to give the car more mechanical grip and make it more forgiving to drive. So, for example, if this play here from front to back is too little, you need to adjust the position of these backstops here. You loosen the set screw and you move these. And the other thing is obviously these holders, which you open with your hands. I'm gonna just demonstrate what happens when you tighten this too much here. So I'm gonna over tighten these so that the battery is actually locked into the car. You can see now it's completely locked, so this is actually gonna obstruct the flex quite a lot, and that's gonna take away a lot of grip. And even worse, it may tweak the car. It's gonna affect the chassis tweak, so the suspension is not gonna work evenly left and right. So we have to open up these screws until these are not pushing onto the battery. In fact, they should have a little bit of upwards play. It's better to have a bit too much play than no play at all. That's always my sort of rule of thumb when it comes to building and setting up a RC car. Okay, so plug this battery in here. Free movement in this direction, upwards and downwards, front to back, and that's a correctly set up battery mounting system for the X4. Fourth most common error. I see a lot of people mount their anti-roll bars too tightly. So when I mean too tightly, I'm talking about that there should be some sideways play for the anti-roll bar here in the bulkhead. The ball bearings, which hold these anti-roll bar collars, they should have a little bit of play here. The anti-roll bar should be able to move sideways, because if you mount these too tightly, the anti-roll bar will actually bind up, especially during cornering when there's load added to the suspension here. So I'm gonna demonstrate this in the next step. I'm gonna make these collars too tight against the bearings, and we're gonna see how it negatively affects the movement of the suspension. And obviously it's gonna have a negative impact on the handling. It's a quick fix, but I often see people make this error. So what I'm referring to here with the sideways play of the anti-roll bar is that this should be able to move here freely from side to side. I mean, not excessive, but just a little bit for the anti-roll bar to be able to move freely and not bind up during cornering. I see a lot of people over tighten these collars against the ball bearings here, and I'm gonna try and demonstrate what happens if you do this. So if you just push these completely against the bearings here, it's actually hard to see from the video, but if you now try and push the suspension up, there's a bit of a limitation to the suspension movement. It's like adding a dampener basically to the suspension, because this is not moving freely anymore. It actually takes a bit more force to be able to move the suspension, so you make the suspension harder. It's gonna take away traction, make the car inconsistent. So hence, having no binding in this section of the car is absolutely vital. So I always set this up to have a little bit of sideways play. Having a bit too much play usually is better than having no play. There's still not enough here. That's a bit too much. Like that is perfect. Now the suspension is moving freely. It's not obstructed by the tension of these collars onto the bearings. This is even more important at the front end of the car. And why? Because the front bulkheads are not connected, so the bulkheads can they can flex a lot in this direction, right? You can see how much I can push the bulkheads against each other, because there's no reinforcement here unless you run the front brace. So then, especially then, it's important to have quite a bit of play for the front anti-roll bar. Usually more play is required for the front anti-roll bar than for the rear when you're not running a front brace. Keep that in mind. The fifth and final most commonly made error in setting up the X4 is the belt tension. So you have two belts in the car, they're equal length because it's a mid-motor car. So the belt tension, I often get asked how do you properly set the belt tension. It's different for stock and modified, because obviously in modified you have a more powerful motor which requires tighter belt setting for the belt not to skip. And in stock classes you want the belt to be as loose as possible without having it skipping, to have less friction from the drivetrain and therefore less motor overheating and basically more power and less fade. So in this next step, I'll show you how to properly set the belt tension for modified as well as spec racing. So belt tension is a subject which I often get asked about, and it's a thing which people often overlook or they don't know how to approach correctly. And I often see belts that are too tight for spec racing or too loose for modified racing. And I often see belt being unevenly tightened between front and rear. And one thing to keep in mind is that the belt tension is adjustable in steps with eccentric holders, front and rear, and you can actually set up these differently front and rear depending on the age of the belt and so on, because when the belts wear, they usually require a tighter setting for the tension, so that you make up for the belt being older and being a bit stretched. So in this case, I'm going to show you my car right here. It's set up for modified racing. So I got the eccentric set to 2 steps tighter than the middle, than the kit setting, which that's usually a good starting point for modified. I usually recommend +1 or +2 for modified racing. I'm going to demonstrate the tightness of the belt. You see when I push this here, or when I pull it, there's quite a bit of tension here because it returns quickly to its original state when I pull it. And same thing when I push it down, you can visibly see that there's a bit of tension to the belts here. And it's very equal between front and rear, which is important. You want the same tension between front and rear. For stock racing, however, this will be considered too tight. So we're gonna loosen the belts 2 steps in front and rear. And I'm gonna show you what I consider to be a optimal setting for spec racing. Okay, so I've just done the rear belt now, just to demonstrate to you what I feel is the optimal setting for spec racing. So in this case, the eccentric is in the middle here for the diff ball bearings, and this is the kit setting. I mean, depending on the belts, especially if the belts are brand new, you may want to go even less tension, so -1 or maybe even -2 in some special situations. How can you see that is the perfect setting? So I'm going to pull the belt up like I did before. You can see it's actually bouncing a bit, like it doesn't return as quickly and as vigorously as before. So it's a lot looser. You can visibly see it not returning as quickly. Also, when I push it down with my finger, it's a lot less tension. So this to me is a perfect setting for stock racing. You can probably use it even looser, especially because we have belt tensioners now built into the car here in the bottom. So you can use the belt looser, but you can add tension with these belt tensioners that are mounted onto the motor mount. So keep in mind that belts should not be too loose for modified racing and not too tight for stock racing, and aim for the same belt tension in front and rear. Keep in mind that the belt tension needs to be adjusted. Usually when the belts wear, when they get older, you need to add tension to the eccentric holders. Alright, I hope that you enjoyed these simple tricks, and maybe you've done some of these errors yourself. Maybe you've learned something from this video. Hopefully it was useful to you in some way. And if you have any other suggestions or comments, please let me know. And have fun racing with your X4. See you guys soon.